Welcome back to MademmyifyASMR, and welcome, of course, to another True Crime Tuesday. If you don't know what True Crime Tuesdays are on my channel, every Tuesday I will tell you a true crime story in a soft-spoken way. Tonight I will be telling you about Amelia Dyer, who was also known as the Reading baby farmer. This story does have trigger warnings. There is a lot of talk of child neglect, especially babies, and child or baby murder, infanticide, I suppose. I struggled a little bit with parts of this story, and usually I don't. I thought it would just be the intro, but throughout it was just awful. So if you think that you'll find anything like that upsetting, then please come back another week, and I will hopefully have another story that you can enjoy. And sorry that this week's isn't for you. Anyway, and also tonight's story is, I've done it slightly different than what it would normally be, or the normal way I would do things. I will explain why in the intro. So let's just get down to Amelia Dyer. Tonight's true crime is about Amelia Dyer, known as the Reading baby farmer. Now I can hear you all rushing to Wikipedia to find out what a baby farmer is, so I shall explain. In late Victorian era Britain, it was quite common for women who had illegitimate children who they could not care for to seek to have the child adopted out of the family. Baby farmer was a term implied as a bit of an insult, as it did imply improper care. But for a fee, a baby farmer would keep a child and raise them. The mothers could take them back eventually, if they so wished. Jane Austen and her siblings were actually wet nursed and fostered by baby farmers in their village. In the Charles Dickens book Oliver Twist, it's mentioned that the titular character spent a year on a baby farm. Not all baby farmers accepted ongoing payments. Some would adopt the child for a flat fee. In these instances, it was more profitable for the baby farmer if the adopted infant or child died, since the payments wouldn't cost the cover of the child's care for long. Some baby farmers would adopt numerous children and either neglect them or outright murder them. And this brings us to Amelia Dyer. Tonight's format is a little different, as I'll speak about one of the mothers who gave up their child. But for me, I think it's an important aspect, and the reason why is my own dad was born in the 60s, and he was actually born into an unmarried mother's home, which was basically another name for these places where they would send young women who were pregnant outside of marriage to hide the shame from the family of having a daughter who had had this child out of wedlock. My dad has never tracked down his birth mother or his birth father. All was blonde, busty and quick-witted, making her popular with the male patrons. The father of her baby was unrecorded, and now she was in a situation many women experienced, deserted with a baby that she loved but could not afford to keep. Her only hope was that she could have Doris fostered or adopted out, as it was referred to, go back to work and hope that one day she could claim Doris back. By chance, an advert in the same paper next to Evelina's read, "Married couple with no family would adopt healthy child, nice country home, terms £10. The advert seemed like the answer to Evelina's prayers, and she quickly contacted the advert's poster, Mrs. Harding of Oxford Road in Reading. Mrs. Harding replied in ecstatic terms, "I should be glad to have a dear little baby girl, one I could bring up and call my own." She went on to explain her situation. "We are plain, homely people, in fairly good circumstances. I don't want a child for money's sake, but for company and home comfort," which to me, it sounds like you want a dog, not a child. "Oh, I just want some home comfort." No, that's a dog. "Myself and my husband are dearly fond of children. I have no child of my own. A child with me will have a good home and a mother's love." To Evelina, Mrs. Harding sounded like the respectable, caring woman she had hoped she would find for Doris, and she replied at once, begging Mrs. Harding not to consider anyone else until they had met. Mrs. Harding replied, "Rest assured, I will do my duty by that dear child. I will be a mother as far as lies in my power. It's just lovely here, healthy and pleasant. There is an orchard opposite our front door." She promised Evelina could visit whenever she wished. The only issue was that Evelina wanted to pay weekly for Doris to be looked after, whereas Mrs. Harding was insistent on a full adoption, with a one-off payment in advance of £10. Reluctantly, the desperate mother agreed, and a week later, Mrs. Harding, clutching a good warm shawl to wrap around the baby in the train, for it is bitter cold, arrived in Cheltenham. Upon meeting her, Evelina was surprised to discover that the woman she had been corresponding with was elderly and thick-set beneath her cape, but she seemed affectionate as she swaddled baby Doris in the shawl. Evelina handed over a cardboard box of clothes that she had packed: nappies, chemises, petticoats, frocks, nightgowns and a powder box, along with the £10. In return, she received a receipt. She accompanied Mrs. Harding to the train station and as far on the train as Gloucester, where she stood on the platform and wept as the 5:20 p.m. train took her girl away. She returned to the lodging house, truly broken by the experience. A few days later, she received a letter from Mrs. Harding informing her all was well. She wrote straight back, but never received a reply. Unfortunately, Evelina and baby Doris had fallen victim to one of the most evil baby farmers in Victorian Britain, and Mrs. Harding was just one of the aliases used by Amelia Dyer. Infant mortality rates were high in Victorian England, so society wasn't as shocked and appalled as we would be today about babies dying suddenly and unexpectedly. Amelia Dyer used this to her advantage. She even described herself as an angel maker to her daughter Polly, who one day asked, curious about the babies that would arrive then disappear. She told her she was sending them to Jesus, as he wanted them far more than their mothers did. The train Amelia Dyer caught in Gloucester didn't go to Reading, where she had told Evelina she was going, but instead pulled into Paddington Station in London at 9 p.m. Dyer struggled off the train with her bag, the box of clothes, and baby Doris whimpering beneath a shawl. She caught a bus to Willesden and got off at Mayo Road. When she reached number 76, she was greeted by her daughter Polly, who at this point in the story was aged 23 and herself married. Once both women were inside their rented room, Dyer rifled through a work basket containing thread and thimbles, looking for some white edging tape, enough to wrap twice around Doris's tiny neck. She then pulled the tape tight, holding it before tying a knot. Doris would have struggled a little before her arms fell limp. She joined the many babies, no one knows for sure how many, that Dyer had killed. Dyer and her daughter then wrapped the body in a cloth. They picked through the clothes Evelina had provided, keeping the good items and putting the rest aside for the pawnbrokers. Dyer used the £10 to pay her rent and even gave the landlady a lovely pair of child's boots for her own daughter. The very next day, on Wednesday, April 1st, 1896, another child, this time 13-month-old Harry Simmons, was given to Dyer for the sum of £10. There was no spare edging tape in the basket, so Dyer unpicked the knot in the length around Doris's neck and reused that to strangle him. The next day, both bodies were stuffed into Amelia Dyer's carpet bag, which was then also filled with bricks to weigh it down. Dyer then caught a train to Reading. Dyer carried the bag through the streets until she reached a spot by a footbridge over the weir at Caversham Lock rather. She pushed the bag through the railings and waited until she heard it hit the water below. As she began to leave, a man hurried past her and said, "Good night." This man's testimony would actually eventually help send Dyer to the gallows. But how did Amelia Dyer end up as a baby farmer, murdering those she was meant to care for? Unlike many of her generation, Dyer was not born into poverty. She was born in a village near Bristol in 1838. Her father was a master shoemaker and she learned to read and write, developing a love of literature. She trained as a nurse, and while in this line of work, she learned from a midwife a far easier way to make a living, providing lodgings in her home for young women who had become pregnant outside of wedlock. For a fee, these women would be taken in and cared for up to the birth of their child. In Victorian society, from the moment the bump began to show, these women would be shunned, even fired from their jobs. After the mothers left, the unwanted babies would be looked after as nurse children. The money differed depending on the family, as a well-off girl with parents anxious to keep the pregnancy secret could pay as much as £80, or they could get £50 if the baby's father wanted to cover up his involvement. But more often than not, these girls were impoverished and considered so immoral. Even the workhouses didn't want them, and the fee would be £5. The baby farmers were keen to cut costs, so the farmed babies were starved, and to stop them crying with hunger, the babies would be sedated with alcohol and sedatives, of opiates rather. I'm sorry if you can hear fireworks going off. Godfrey's cordial was a widely available syrup that was used to quieten the infants. It was laced with laudanum and known colloquially as the quietness, as it would put a child straight to sleep, and if the child died from the mixture, so be it. Most did sooner or later. I'm sure that I've heard of Godfrey's formula before, and that it was mixed essentially by the pharmacist, though you didn't have mass-produced medicine like you do now. So like the pharmacist would mix it, and so if the pharmacist put too much laudanum in it, there was a higher chance that that child wasn't going to survive, because it didn't really have the accurate measuring tools either. One of these unmarried mothers' homes was described in horrific detail by a police officer who came across one in Brixton. They were ashen-faced and emaciated, like little crones, their bones visible through transparent skin. In one room, 5 3- and 4-week-old infants lay in filth, 3 under a shawl on a sofa, 2 stuffed into a small crib. They lay open-mouthed in a state of torpor, eyes glazed, scarcely human. What chilled the policeman the most was the silence. Instead of the noises to be expected from a child of tender age, they were lying without a moan from their wretched lips and apparently dying. 5 more infants were in another room. They were in slightly better condition, as a weekly fee was being paid instead of the one-off premium. Those were a one-off payment were encouraged to die quickly. Dyer realised that although an immoral business, there was a pile of money to be made from it. Dyer realised it was easier and indeed more lucrative to straight up murder the infants rather than wait for them to die from neglect. Year after year, Dyer managed to dodge police and inspections from the NSPCC that had recently been formed. She did get caught once by a doctor who became suspicious of how many death certificates he was issuing to Dyer, and he alerted authorities. Strangely, she was only convicted of allowing a child to die through neglect and not manslaughter. She served 6 months hard labour in prison, an experience that nearly killed her. After her release from prison, Dyer attempted to go back to nursing and had spells in mental hospitals following suicide attempts, but eventually she went back to baby farming, bringing her daughter in on the business. She decided it was best to stop calling the doctor to issue the death certificates and instead would dispose of the bodies secretly. They moved home frequently, as often as they caught on that police were closing in or that there was a mother or father on their trail, hoping to reclaim their child. In fact, the killings only stopped after a bargeman travelling up the Thames at Reading saw a brown paper parcel lying on the riverbank. He fished it out of the river with his bow hook. He then pulled one end of the package and saw a tiny human leg and foot. A police inspection revealed the child was between 6 to 12 months of age. White tape was knotted around the infant's neck, and a piece of brown paper revealed a railway label from Bristol Temple Meads Station. A faint address could be made out too, a Mrs. Thomas, from an address in Reading. On April the 1st, police raided the address of On April the 3rd, police raided the address and were immediately struck by a foul odour of decomposition, but no body was found. Police did, however, find white tape in a sewing basket, and bundles of telegrams arranging adoptions were found in a cupboard, along with pawn tickets for children's train station, but that evening Dyer had returned home with only a box and no child in sight. She hid the box in the house for 3 weeks, at which point the smell became unbearable, so she took the package to the river and disposed of it. At this point, the river was dragged and 3 further bodies were found, along with the carpet bag containing Doris and Harry, who were her most recent victims. The next day, Evelina, whose name had been found in Dyer's correspondence, was brought to Reading to identify her daughter, just 11 days after she had met Mrs. Harding. She was in perfect health when I left her, was all the distraught mother could say. Dyer was hanged at Newgate Prison. During her trial, she tried to plead insanity, but this was rejected. Her daughter gave graphic evidence against her mother, but for reasons unknown, maybe she'd had some kind of plea deal if she testified, she herself was not tried. The jury in the case deliberated for just 4.5 minutes. The crime caused a massive scandal. Tougher adoption laws were brought in to stamp out abuse in baby farms. Personal acts were also scrutinised, but unfortunately this didn't stop the baby trafficking trade. Interestingly, 2 years after Dyer's death, railway workers inspecting a carriage in a siding in Newton Abbot uncovered a parcel. In the parcel was a 3-week-old baby girl, barely alive. She was the daughter of Jane Hill, a widow, and had been sold for £12 to a Mrs. Stewart, who had just dumped her on the next train. Who was Mrs. Stewart? None other than Polly Dyer, although I think she had a different surname. Amelia Dyer's daughter. She was caught, and both her and her husband were sent to prison, and they served just 2 months hard labour in prison, which is nothing really considering they tried to kill a 3-week-old baby. And of course, as I mentioned before, unmarried mothers' homes was still a thing, and I think in America the adoption laws are still that you can buy a child, although baby farming isn't a thing.